Welcome everyone. Je parle français, mais for this event I will speak in English to save your ears because it'll be hard to hear. I've been building a new kind of platform and organization for the last 10 years, and we've just done a major revision to a book, and I want to talk through some of that, and then we'll do some Q&A. We're living clearly in a post-pandemic world, and a world of increased black swans, right? Every month or two something happens. In the US, a few months ago, Silicon Valley Bank collapsed, completely unexpected. We're seeing what's happening in the Middle East, which is quite a nightmare. And I want to talk through what that means. So there's three parts to this. One is, what is the fundamental issue that's happening? How do you as an organization deal with this new world? And how do we even think about leadership going forward? My background, I'm originally from India. I spent 10 years here in Europe. I'm Canadian. I've spent the last 20 years in the US, so I'm very confused. Really, my journey starts, I was the head of innovation at Yahoo, running their incubator. And I learned a fundamental lesson that's driving a lot of my thinking these days, which is when you try anything disruptive in a legacy organization or a legacy institution, the immune system attacks you. Because all of our organizations are built to resist change and withstand risk. And yet, high order change and disruptive change is now the first order element. How do we juxtapose with that for all of our organizations, all of our institutions, even government is a major question, and we've been thinking about that. I went from Singularity University to building out an organization called Singularity University, which I ran for about 7 years. And we were bringing together the leading thinkers in the world in very fast-moving technologies. And on the back of that, I wrote this book on how do you organize for the 21st century? How do you build an organization that can scale as fast as technology scales? If you're in technology, we know how to scale technology, but building the organization is painfully incremental and linear, and that gap is something we've tried to address. And I'm going to jump straight to some of the results we're seeing. This is the model in the book. I'll touch on this a little bit more. But basically, we found a set of characteristics used by fast-moving organizations that allow them to scale in the model that I mentioned. And when I wrote the book, we scored the Fortune 100, the biggest 100 companies in the US, against this model. So these are organizations measured against how viable, purpose-driven, agile, flexible, scalable is the actual organization structure. We did a segment on a stock market program in the US talking this through. And then Chander, who's sitting over here, did some work for UBS and did a 7-year analysis of how did they do over a 7-year period. And what we measured was the top 10 most EXO-friendly, in a sense, and really the most scalable agile companies versus the least scalable agile companies according to our model. And then we compared the results. Right? So the top 10 most adhere close to the model and the ones that were furthest from the model. And here's the results. The top 10 beat the bottom 10 by huge amounts on revenue growth, 6 times more profitable, 11 times better return on equity, but shareholder returns was 40 times higher. Right? And that's just in the Fortune 100. So we may have stumbled across the most important heuristic for the 21st century, which is as the external world becomes more volatile, your ability to adapt will drive market value. And now we can prove that in a number of ways. So where does this all start? It starts here with this graph, which was put together by Ray Kurzweil. Bill Gates calls Ray the smartest man alive. He's been studying accelerating technologies for about 40 years, and he put this graph together with Moore's law, studying the price performance of computation, and he found that although we double every 18 months computational power, he found that's been happening for over 100 years, way before Gordon Moore from Intel made his predictions. The question that he asked when he saw this data is, why is this curve so smooth and so predictable? We've had wars and recessions and ups and downs in the industry. You should expect a very jagged stock market type shape. And yet you see this unbelievably predictable progression. It doesn't make sense. He spent 10 years researching this, trying to understand it, came up with a fundamental observation that is now driving the thinking of a lot of people in this world, which is you take a domain or a discipline or a product area or a technology, and you power it with information technologies. And it acquires informational flow capabilities. Once that happens, the price performance starts doubling. And most importantly, once that doubling starts, it does not stop. It just keeps going. And cognitively, we have a very difficult time with this. We can't imagine, you have to level off, etc. And the secret is in the multiple technologies that we've had in computation. When we reach, say we use vacuum tubes, we accelerate that. We reach the upper limits of vacuum tubes, but then we find transistors. And we go through an S-curve of acceleration in transistors, and then we reach the upper limit, and then we shift to integrated circuits. Now we're reaching the upper limit of integrated circuits because the chips are getting very hot. We're down to a few nanometers of wire thickness. But now we have a set of technologies clustering here at the edge, ready to take it to the next level. 3D chip design, optical computing, quantum computing is a likely candidate, but that requires a lot of alcohol, so we'll wait till later for that discussion. Essentially, we're entering a world of infinite computation, infinite storage. And what could you do with that? Right? And this led Peter Diamandis to write a book called Abundance, charting out that if we can harness this acceleration and leverage it, we'll go from scarcity to abundance in a number of very important domains like education, healthcare, clean water, energy in about 10 years. And what does that world look like? Peter is the founder of the X Prize Foundation, which gives large public prizes wherever there are market failures. I joined the board of X Prize a few years ago. It has some rather interesting characters in it. Every board meeting starts with, what did Elon just do? And then we move on to the rest of the business of the day. Very disruptive discussion. And what we do is we found that when we offer a prize of, say, $10 million for something, about 30 or 40 teams will spend $150 million in R&D trying to win the $10 million. So it's an incredibly powerful leveraged innovation model returning something like 15x return. We just announced the $100 million the $100 million carbon extraction X Prize funded by Elon Musk to extract carbon at scale out of the atmosphere. There are 1,300 teams in the semifinals. So the aggregate innovation from that we expect will have a major impact on climate. And that graph I showed you is a little out of date. It goes to 2008, but look at the recent data. It's going exactly on curve, right? Unbelievable progression, very, very steady. So we're seeing this kind of machine just move along. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. The challenge when you have exponential growth is our brains don't see it. All of our education, all of our training in the world teaches us linear progression. Right, all of our intuition. So if I take 30 steps linearly, I'll go 30 meters, I'll get to the other side of this building. We can all predict very well where I am a third of the way or 2/3 of the way in that progression. We're very good at that linear extrapolation. But if I take 30 doubling steps, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, at step 30, I've gone 1 billion meters. I'm actually 26 times around the world, which is a bit further than the end of the building, and very hard to estimate 1/3 of the way or 2/3 of the way in that progression. And yet more and more of the world is operating on this new dynamic, and this is very difficult for us to see. Today, one thing that is completely unique is we now have a dozen technologies that are now on this doubling pattern. We've never seen this before in the history of humanity. Throughout our history, maybe one technology is accelerating or maybe another. Today we have a dozen all moving at this pace. In neuroscience, the resolution at which we can image the brain is doubling every year. Drones are doubling every 9 months in their price performance. The speed at which we can sequence the human genome is doubling every 6 months. That may be the fastest moving technology we've ever seen. So this is completely new in the world to see all of these technologies all accelerating. Now, each of them is accelerating on their own. Where you see an intersection, that adds a whole other multiplier to the equation. And so we see unbelievable launches of products and services at the intersections of some of these capabilities. I'm going to give you one analogy that we found that explains this very well, is photography. Some of you may be old enough to remember film photography. Right? You're operating on a physical material substrate. You're operating from a scarcity model. Right? It costs about €1 a photograph to do the processing. When you move to digital photography and you move to the information-based environment, 3 very important things happen. First, marginal cost goes to 0. Now we can take 1,000 photographs, the cost does not change at all. As a result of that, the domain completely explodes, and before, where we would very carefully take a click here or take a click there, we're holding the button down today on all of our devices and taking billions of times more photographs because the cost is gone. Right? The third effect, which is a little more subtle but very important, especially from a business perspective, is you change the problem space. So in a scarcity problem space, the big challenge I have is how do I take the best photograph? I only have 36 photographs in my roll. I take courses in photography. I publish books on composition. I may make money selling very expensive cameras, and you get a whole bunch of business models that crop up to help you optimize that scarcity. When you go to digital photography, you have a fundamentally different problem. You change the problem space. Now the challenge that we have in photography is we all have six copies of our photographs on 7 different online services, and you can't find anything. And you go from a sourcing problem to a filtering problem, right? Most importantly, all of the business models like expensive cameras or course, all gone. Nobody can make money doing the old model. We've seen the same thing in music. We used to have 6 or 7 major music studios selling scarcity, selling you a cassette, a CD, a DVD. Then we digitized music, and now you have 2 platforms, iTunes and Spotify, selling you abundance on a subscription model. And that's the transformation we expect to see in healthcare, education, in transportation, in energy. We think more and more domains, as we digitize them, go to this new model. I'm going to touch on one technology to give you a sense of it. The rage today is all these AI, LLMs, ChatGPT, stability diffusion. We've been tracking this for about 6 years, ever since the original paper was launched. And the reason that we need AI is there's a tsunami of data hitting us. If you're a cancer doctor today, there are 2,000 new cancer research papers published every day. And there's no hope that you have of keeping track of all that. So you need an AI to make sense of it and winnow it down and reduce it for you, summarize it for you, etc. Right? And that's where we think AI will be profoundly useful. I'll touch on one industry that we're seeing now tip over into viability, which is agriculture, the second oldest industry in the world. Now, we've been doing horizontal farming since the beginning of civilization, but now we're doing vertical farming, hydroponics, aeroponics. We're drip feeding water to the plants. The sensors in the plants tell us exactly what nutrients they need, etc. This is now economically viable, and it's doubling every year or so. Okay? The best calculation we have seen is if you took 35 skyscrapers in Manhattan and turned those into vertical farms, just that would feed the entire city sustainably. So you don't need millions of square kilometers of farmland, you need just a few buildings, and boom, you're done. This will have a major effect on food security, logistics, transportation, etc., etc. We don't need pesticides, we don't need fertilizer, and so on. So massive change coming as we go through this model, right? The enormous impact of just this domain changes everything. In the US, the average meal travels 4,000 kilometers to get to your table. So all of the infrastructure and supply chain now gets disrupted as a result of this. Today, most of the lettuce or arugula that you eat is already vertically farmed today. Right? That's already happening. To give you an example of how this is already in place, these are the largest food production countries in the world, and you can imagine they're the biggest. Right? They have the most land mass, and therefore India or China or Brazil or the US produces the most food. But then you look at the largest food exporting countries in the world, and look at number 2. It's Holland. Right? Now you all know Holland, it's a dot of a country. Right? It's barely the size of one of the provinces here in France. And this is the second largest food exporting country in the world because they've aggressively used technology, greenhouses, aeroponics, and they export $60 billion of food a year. Okay? And so that's what's possible if you as a country or as a company embrace this and make a long-term commitment. You're able to do something very dramatic in a way that's not possible in a normal way. I won't go through all of these technology, just want to give you that hint of it, because then the best way we found of framing this is in the 15th century, we had the Gutenberg printing press appear. And it completely changed society because it democratized literature. Right? I would argue today that we have 20 Gutenberg moments hitting us at the same time, because vertical farming completely changes the world. Blockchain completely changes the world. Solar energy completely changes the world. We have 20 of these. AI fundamentally changes the world. And so how do we absorb 20 Gutenberg moments all happening at the same time? It took us 100 years to absorb the printing press. Just that took us 100 years. So we really need some upgrade in how we deal with society, because all of the institutions by which we run the world don't work in this new world. Every mechanism, like take education for example, all our education systems are designed to take a young child, train them through their early 20s to be ready for the job market. Small problem, we have no idea what a job looks like in 5 years. What are we teaching them? Right? And so I could go on with all of these other institutions, but E.O. Wilson, the famous biologist, summarized it very well. He said, we have Paleolithic emotions, our institutions are medieval, and our technology is godlike. Pretty much all of the problems in the world come from reconciling those three layers, right? And basically, as a global species, we'll spend the next few decades reconciling this gap, because it's growing, because the technology is accelerating, but our emotions and our brains are still reptilian. And so navigating that is all of the issues that we can see in the world. You can see where the future of agriculture is going with what's happening in Gaza today, right? We have two futures in front of us, a Mad Max future or a Star Trek future. And all our politicians are pointing us straight towards Mad Max, and technology could give us a very different world. The second thing that's happening that's unbelievably powerful because of what's all this technology development is the cost of technology is dropping very dramatically. Here's the cost of light over a period of time, and I want you to pay attention to the shape of that curve. Very expensive, plateaus for a while, and then it crashes. Here's the same shape in biotech gene sequencing. Here's the same shape in solar energy. And something that is completely unique today is that technology after technology, the price is crashing. Okay? Now this is again completely unique and new. Throughout human history, it was always true that advanced technologies cost a lot. And only a government or a big corporate lab could do R&D, launch new products and services. Today, for the first time in human history, advanced technologies are very cheap. Solar energy is cheap, sensors are cheap, the blockchain is open source and free. The cost of programming and developing these large language models has dropped 99% in the last 3 years. Right? It's unbelievable what we're seeing in there. And again, that's quite unique. Just as a real world example, when we were doing space shuttle launches, it cost about $600 million per space shuttle launch. Okay? SpaceX dropped that by 10x with the repeatable rockets. They brought it down to $60 million a launch. This is relativity space. They're 3D printing the rocket engines. They're going to be able to do it for $6 million. Now, rocket engines are not like some Silicon Valley gaming, social media, digital play. This is real fuel with physical rockets, and it's not a digital environment. And yet there we've seen a 100x drop in a 20-year period, meaning we can launch 100 times more stuff into space. Right? The implications of that are very profound. And this drop in cost is leading to the final dynamic, which is the sheer democratization of this. Because all of these technologies are going through this type of a curve where a domain becomes digital, the cost drop to near zero, you get open source communities forming, and you get radical disruption of the status quo. And whether it's drones or biotech or Bitcoin, it's happening across the board. Right? This means anybody can enter a legacy environment with a beginner's mind, leverage new technologies, and totally change it. Elon Musk is the best example of this. And by the way, if you think about how Elon Musk operates, it's very simple, his methodology. He looks at a technology that's growing exponentially. Solar energy, battery technology, neural links, whatever. Where will that technology be on a 10-year doubling pattern? And he plots that point, and then he aims to build a company to intercept that curve. And that's what he does. He just rinses and repeats, right? And to give you an example of a non-Silicon Valley example, this is the Vega. It's the third fastest car in the world. Okay, 900 horsepower, looks rather beautiful. This is being designed and engineered and built in Sri Lanka, okay, that hotbed of automotive innovation. This is an island of fishermen and farmers. Okay? And if you can do this there with no money, no investors, no ecosystem, no expertise, no experience, pretty much I would argue you can do anything anywhere. I love showing this to German car executives. Their brains break. They just can't compute how this is possible, right? So we're expecting to see the most unbelievable amount of disruptive innovation coming from every corner in the world. Okay, so then if you get the sense that we have 20 Gutenberg moments hitting us, the world is radically accelerating, how do you adapt to this? How do you cope with this? How do you deal with this? And this quote from David Rose, he's one of the godfathers of angel investing. This has been stuck in my head for about a decade. He makes the point that all of our organizations are architected for two primary heuristics: efficiency and predictability. We're trying to deliver the same widget in 100 countries. We're trying to deliver the same Big Mac in 1 million locations around the world. But today, you need to be architected for flexibility, adaptability, agility, and speed. And that requires a very different organizational model than what we had before. And this is what led us to writing this book, basically saying, okay, how do you how do you build an organization structure that is adaptive and purpose-driven and scalable and designed for 21st century thinking and the speed and volatility of the 21st century environment? What we did was we scanned about 200 of the fastest growing companies 10 years ago and teased out this model. How were they doing it? And I described the model already. Let me delve into it a little bit. We found that all of them had what we call an MTP, or a massive transformative purpose. Google, organize the world's information. Uber, everybody should have a private driver. TED, ideas worth spreading. And we found all of them had this. By the way, in the big company world, Paul Pullman, who was the CEO of Unilever, asked me to come in to talk to his top 100 executives. And after I finished my session, he ordered every brand in Unilever to take on an MTP. 4 years later, the 5 most profitable brands were the ones that had adopted it the most. So we're seeing start to see the model bite. The CEO of Gucci did the same thing, and he basically built Gucci up over the last few years on the same model. Then we found there were 5 externalities that were used by these companies that allowed them to keep a very small feature footprint and scale very quickly. So Uber doesn't hire its own staff, and that allows it to scale very fast. TED uses community to run TEDx events all around the world. That allows it to scale. Google or Microsoft is now using algorithms aggressively. Airbnb is leveraging other people's bedrooms, right? And then you have digital engagement, gamification, incentive prizes to keep a close tab on your end user. So those were the 5 externalities that we found. And then we found 5 internal mechanisms, interfaces between you and that outside abundance. Uber with its drivers, say, real-time dashboards tracking the business metrics in real time. The whole lean startup methodology is built into what we call experimentation, constantly testing assumptions and building new hypotheses. Decentralized organization structures, pushing decision-making as far to the edge of the company as possible. And then all the social technologies like Slack, Yammer, Zoom, etc. We have very good evidence, for example, that peer-to-peer collaboration is much more powerful and productive than top-down traditional command and control communication, right? So this is basically the model. We just launched the 2nd edition of this book, and that's essentially what we're talking about today. It took us like 5 years to rewrite this. And in fact, we had to rewrite the whole thing again over the last 6 months because of ChatGPT, every characteristic changes fundamentally. Say experimentation, we can now use AI to even design the experiments that we should be running. And the definition of an exponential organization is that we have marginally crashed the cost of supply. So for example, if you're Airbnb, the marginal cost of adding a room to your supply side inventory is near 0. If you're Hyatt, you have to build a hotel, right? Same thing with Uber, same thing with Waze. So now you have all of these market entries into legacy environments that have a near 0 marginal cost of supply. And because of the internet, you have near 0 marginal cost of demand. So now you have companies exploding in market cap, and this is fundamentally why. I'll give you another example, a slightly old world example, which is used cars. If you think about used cars, it's not obvious how you would disrupt that. Maybe you have a better warranty. Maybe you have better delivery mechanisms. Maybe you have a slightly better analysis of the car. This is Guazi, a Chinese used car company. What they do is when somebody wants to sell a car, we show up at your car and we gather 250 data points. We take an audio of the engine, run it through a machine learning algorithm, and by sensing the perturbation and the noise of the engine, they can tell the value of the engine. How stable is the engine? They have a pricing model that generates a value for that car. Let's say it's 10,000 euros. Okay? We show you that price. We say, right, that's the value of your car. We will give you 10% less than that in cash on the spot. Will you take it? Probably. Right? Then we go to somebody that wants to buy a car and say, if car worth $10,000, we'll sell it to you for 10% more. That's it. That's their model. They're 8 years old. They've captured 80% of the used car market in China. 80% from zero in 8 years just by using this model. That's the speed, and this is a used cars, right? Again, it's not a digital Silicon Valley gaming play. This is a physical fundamental thing. So by applying new techniques and new capabilities, you have massive radical success in a ridiculously short space of time. They sell 2 million cars a month, right? And even in China, that's a large number. Okay? So we found that this applies. If you're a startup, you should be using all of these attributes. We now have very good evidence that the more of these attributes they use, the more successful and scalable is your organization. We have a bunch of implications that came out in the first book. We have a whole section called Death to the 5-Year Plan. Many big companies operate on 5-year strategic plans. Well, today, by the time you finish your 5-year plan, it's out of date, right? So now you spend all your time maintaining the plan and not actually building the business. And so how do you deal with that? Number 8 is a fascinating one. Trust beats control, and open beats closed, right? Which is a big one, especially here in France, where people don't trust their employees at all, with reason in some cases. In the second edition, we have a whole bunch of new insights and implications. I'll just touch on one, which is data-driven leadership. I was talking about the car industry. If you're the global head of supply chain for BMW, you've gotten to that position because you have 30 years of experience. Maybe you're doing supply chain for Spain, or supply chain for pistons and engine parts, and you got better and better and took on more and more capabilities. Eventually, you become the global head of supply chain. You know if there's a recession, which suppliers are reliable. If there's a geopolitical problem, where to mitigate the issues. Well, today, that doesn't work, because all of that experience is irrelevant when we have so many dramatic shocks hitting us, and we have electric cars that don't need any supply chain. Right? So that completely changes the game. Now what you need to be doing is running tons and tons of experiments, gathering the data and ruthlessly following the data. And that's a very different heuristic for leadership and how we think about that going forward. I talked through this already. Again, I'm just going to cover this last point. What Chandra found was that these companies big companies following this model deliver 40 times the shareholder returns than the ones that don't. What we've done with big companies is we've come up with a tool set called an EXO Sprint that solves this immune system problem that I mentioned at the beginning. We found a way of hacking culture at scale in large organizations. It's a 10-week program. We piloted it with Procter & Gamble. We've now run it 60 times with big companies. And we found we can move leadership culture, management thinking 3 years ahead in that 10-week period. And we've done it, as I said, a few dozen times around the world. Let me end on this note, and then we'll open it up for some questions and some comments. Today, if you think about the greatest leaders in the world, whether they're political leaders or technology leaders or cultural leaders, I would argue today that if you took Steve Jobs, or you took Anusha Ansari, or Elon Musk, and dropped them in the desert with no money and no capability, they will figure a way out. Why? Because it's not their resources or their capital, it's their mindset. And when thinking about the future, we came across and identified 6 mindsets that are critical for success in this 21st century. A curiosity mindset, constantly asking new questions. An abundance mindset, right? I talked about already how Elon has an exponential mindset and is looking for doubling patterns in every investment he makes. A moonshot mindset. Where is the place in your company where is the crazy ideas department to allow people to really experiment and go try a huge effort? A longevity mindset, because it looks today that we're going to be living for a very long period of time, and we need to cope and mentally deal with that idea. And finally, a gratitude mindset, right? Because despite what you read, the world is infinitely better today on any metric you want to choose than any time in the past, except for climate change. That's the only big problem area. So that's a pretty amazing thing to see how we've done. And so we found that these are the mindsets one needs to navigate this future. For the second edition, we actually built an entire chatbot based on ChatGPT and Stability, where you can go, which is free to use, by the way. You can go and say, I have a shipping company in Brazil. How do I 10x my company? And it will literally scan the entire corpus of the book, all the interviews we've done, all the case studies, and come back to you and say, here's the 5 things you need to do. So this becomes really interesting as we think about building and scaling organizations. We're doing for this launch event a 3 years subscription for the price of 1, because we've turned this whole thing into a subscription model. About $20 a month gives you access to the whole community. We have a community of 34,000 consultants, technologists, entrepreneurs, innovators in 150 countries that are applying this model. There's a survey, which is what we use to score the Fortune 100, where you can score your company, which is also free. And it's a really, if you want a great little exercise, have the C-suite in your company score the company, and then have the middle management in your company score it, and then have the people at the bottom score the company, and just compare the results. It's kind of incredible, because the C-suite invariably says, we're the greatest, most flexible, agile company ever, and down at the bottom, they're like, we're the worst, most linear, most bureaucratic company ever. And that conversation, just having that conversation is incredibly powerful. So there's a link if you want to take a snapshot of that. We're offering this promotion where you can get 3 years of subscription for the price of one, just for the launch event for this book. Because we think that the way we ran businesses in the 20th century is essentially completely changed. And we have to essentially unlearn 50 years of Harvard MBA thinking and relearn to totally new models. We've been seeing this model now operate for about 10 years. We have all of the data and anecdotes to show that this is the heuristic on which we need to organize. And not just for private sector, but also for public sector. Right? Lucian is taking this and applying this at a governmental level all around the world. Basically, our thesis today is that over the next 10 years, every company, every nonprofit, every impact project, every government department will organize itself in this way, or it won't exist, because it's just better. And so that's the heuristic. We did a ChatGPT type image generation to see what would this decade look like. We thought that was pretty good. I didn't draw that, by the way, so as you know. So let me pause there. Thank you very much for coming. It's been great to be here. Questions and answers. Merci beaucoup.